What you deal with in Say More about perception versus reality, and communicating reality can be difficult because perception is strong. And I think we have a really good example with the economy in the United States right now. It's doing relatively well, and yet 65% rate the economy as good during Trump's presidency versus 38% under Biden's. Why? What is the failure of communication there?
Well, it's always blamed on communication. I think there's actually a couple of bigger factors here. One of them is there is a nostalgia for the pre-COVID era in the United States. It may just be how people felt before that trauma, before that fear. That's a factor. And the Trump campaign and people around him are effectively trying to hammer home that nostalgia. So I guess that is effective messaging in some ways on their part. I think the other factor here is the economic data is definitely improving, as you said. Inflation is going down, economic growth is going up, but you can't tell people how they feel about the economy. And sometimes data is a leading indicator, but it's not the indicator that determines people's emotions. So if you're in the Biden campaign or the Biden administration, you'd rather have the economic data you have now than the alternative, but you're mindful that as it relates to public approval, what you need to do is continue to drive home the contrast and the comparison to the alternative. And there are things like the tax cuts to the highest income Americans expire next year. That may seem like, oh, that doesn't impact that many people. I mean, it's all relative, right? It impacts a small percentage as it relates to the top tax bracket. They're deeply unpopular in the United States, those tax cuts. And that is one of the comparisons. Trump would continue them, Biden would not. And that is, so it's about that, but it's about really conveying to the public, I'm going to fight for you if you're Joe Biden, and he's going to fight for himself.
In that regard, how effective a communicator is Donald Trump? I know that the facts, he's on trial. You know, we're outsiders from another country. We see everything that is happening. We know the conversations, and yet he seems to be a really effective communicator. I don't for a second think you're going to vote for him, but I'm wondering if you can give me a sense of what he does right in communication.
I've said this many times before. His communications is effective in part because it's simple and it's consistent and it sparks an emotion in people. Has aggrieved, it is angry, has spurred people to violence and has spurred people to attack our institutions that are the foundation of who we are. But it does spur an emotion where millions of people in the United States feel he's aggrieved, I'm aggrieved, he understands me. So there's an effectiveness in that message, as dark as that may be. And I think sometimes what happens with the political parties here is Democrats can become a little technocratic and a little technocratic about how they explain things. And I mean, I have a whole chapter in my book on this about the use of overly formal language and overly fancy language when you're trying to prove that you are smart and that you know what you're talking about. But sometimes, and some Democrats, not all, are guilty of this, sometimes it's exclusionary because people feel they don't understand what you're talking about. It is not English to them. And Trump speaks in aggrieved, angry language, but it is often accessible. And that can be an effective, though dark, communications tactic.
You paint a very good picture of what is happening in the White House. I feel nervous for you when I read the book. And it made me think about what is happening right now. You started your days with a news briefing. I would be remiss if I didn't do the same thing. So we're talking about no ceasefire. We're talking about Israel going into Rafah. And I'm wondering, based on your experience, what is happening in the White House right now with that confusing state of affairs?
Well, just to state for the audience, I haven't worked there in 2 years, so I don't know specifically what is happening right now. But what I can tell you from having traveled with former Secretary of State John Kerry and worked at the State Department and obviously worked for President Biden. So my bet, having spent a fair amount of time working in the US government, is that Bill Burns, the CIA director, Secretary Blinken, the Secretary of State, have been back and forth with their counterparts. They're on the phone with President Biden. He likes to get very regular updates, and they're trying to figure out how they can get these discussions back on track.
I think one thing we've all learned is that miscommunication, misinformation is dangerous. You know, it can actually kill people. And so I'm wondering to what degree your instinct tells you that the confusion is not just a frustration, it's worrying.
If you look at the last 24 to 48 hours, is that you had an attack by Hamas on a border crossing that clearly impacted these discussions. That meant more aid wasn't able to get through. There's lots of confusion among citizens. There's anger, of course, and outrage in the region. Some of that has, of course, spilled out over into the United States and other parts of the world. It's hard to really pinpoint exactly what factor disinformation has on there, but there's no question that it's a factor. It creates confusion. It creates false hope sometimes. It also creates a blame game at times when actually initial reports aren't telling the full story.
So the blame game is an interesting point. 55%, according to Gallup, 55% of Americans disapprove of Israel's actions in Gaza. So that's interesting. But CBS also says that the numbers of Americans who say Biden should encourage Israel to stop is growing. So what kind of position does that put him in? And how do you think he's handling this?
Well, I think what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, even months, is actually even a shift, which is quite significant when it comes to the U.S.-Israeli relations, given the long history here. And President Biden, having worked for him for a year and a half, is somebody who is very much a believer in that relationship. The United States was starting to hold back some weapons deliveries, which may seem like one thing, but it is significant when it comes to, given the history of the relationship. There's a lot of pressure in the US Congress also to use greater leverage as it relates to aid and assistance to Israel. That is significant. But the challenge here is that, just a few weeks ago, there were attacks from Iran on Israel. So what the challenge is, I think, is more leverage needs to be used. And I would say probably they should have been doing more leverage sooner. And the other problem is Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, as you know, is a deeply unpopular leader, but also is in some ways incentivized to keep this military action going because it's in part for his own political survival.
So a couple weeks ago, I was in Jordan doing airdrops over Gaza, went to Qatar, do a medical evacuation out of Gaza, talked to a lot of people on the ground, and they said interesting things about the United States. One was that Netanyahu was playing Biden, and two is that they had never seen the Americans appear so weak, that airdrops had to happen that way. And I'm wondering how that will sit in the White House. Presumably they know that, but how is that going to sit in the White House, and how do they deal with that?
If you're sitting in the White House, you definitely know that. You're talking to leaders in the Middle East. You have diplomats in the Middle East and all of these countries. You definitely hear and understand what people are saying and their concerns. And if you're in the White House, you also share the concerns. I mean, there are tens of thousands of Gazans who have died, women and children. If you don't find that horrifying, you're inhuman. And certainly the president, I am betting, and members of the national security team feel that anger and pain. The challenge is that everybody wants a ceasefire. It's how you get there and what the process is and the diplomatic steps to get there. And Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't just do it because Joe Biden says he should. That's just not what incentivizes him to take action. He thinks about his own political survival and what he needs to do in his own country. And so that's one of the challenges here.
So does that stopping of that weapons shipment have a much bigger impact than all the protests?
I would think that that factor, especially given the reliance on U.S. military assistance, would be a factor. But to what end, we don't know. Does it mean he changes his rhetoric? Does it mean he is less aggressive? Does it mean he stops his forward movement into Rafah? I mean, probably, I don't know. But, I think the objective is to incentivize and to use leverage to change his behavior. But it doesn't guarantee an outcome of a changed behavior. And that is how diplomacy works.
As we head into November, I don't recall foreign policy being a driver of votes in the past. But the world is changing a little bit. And I wonder to what degree you think it may actually be a driver of votes this time. Or is it going to be reproductive rights? Or is it going to be...
There have been moments, including on presidential campaigns I've worked on, and when I worked for Barack Obama in 2007 and 8, his opposition to the Iraq War was part of what helped him build support during the primary process here. It didn't end up being the deciding factor in the 2008 election because of the financial crisis, but that was a factor then. So it can be, but I think right now it's hard to know. What is interesting is obviously we have on a number of college campuses, not monolithic protests and not monolithic protesters, which is, I think, important for people to understand. And there are some colleges and universities where they have come to an agreement on a path forward. Imperfect, probably, hard to deliver on. Things like the discussion of divestment from Israel by a couple of schools. Again, imperfect, and I think that's hard to deliver on, but it is a sign of activism. There's generational change in terms of the views of the Middle East, I think, in this country. But what's also true, which may feel conflicting and confusing, and I'm often surprised when I see this in polls, is that there was a Harvard University poll of young people, people 18 to 29, I'm still young in a different way, who, and kind of what they cared about. And the number one issue was the economy, the cost of living, the cost of healthcare. So is foreign policy, look, I'm a national security nerd. I always think it matters. And I think more people should think it matters. It does matter. But I think if you're on the campaign, you have to factor in what is popping up time and time and time again in terms of the issues front and center for people, because that's a teller. And the last thing I'll just say is abortion rights, which is so interesting because it's rarely like a top 3 or top 5 issue in a lot of polls. Polls are imperfect, of course, but it is a passionate driver for people. And it turns out, we've seen in the last elections here, as it turns out, surge voters, or what we sometimes call double haters, people who don't like any of the candidates, but they're mad about abortion rights. And that's something that's very going to be vital to the Biden campaign, because they need those voters, and they need voters who are independents, who are independent women, who are independent men, or even Republicans who just don't like the direction on abortion rights. So it's a driver in a different way.
I would imagine you're a bit of a horse in the gate, that there are moments when you'd like to get back in there and steer a direction. And I'm wondering what direction you think they should be capitalizing on in the White House that they're not right now.
When I worked for President Obama, we did a lot of this, and we were criticized for it, but I think it's important to do regardless, is interviews that break out of the mold of the typical political conversation. And to be clear, I think engagement with the press is hugely important. That's why I did a briefing every day and then did it at the State Department. And I think press conferences are good, and interviews with a range of outlets are good for the president. But I also think that part of what moves people is seeing your humanity and seeing who you are as a person and having real conversations that people have at their kitchen tables. And that's why I think things like the president did an interview with Howard Stern recently. They did one with Smartless, a very popular podcast. Those are very good. And I think they should do more of those.
Well, especially there is a candidate now, the current president, you cannot avoid the age conversation with him. There are concerns about his age, and there are visuals that back up the concerns. That's got to be difficult to deal with.
You know, I think that has been one of their biggest challenges since back when I was there more than 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And at this point, though, that was more prominent here, I would say, when it was unclear to the public, which is a little bit more clear now, that Trump is the opponent, and they're about 3 years apart. So yes, I think it's important for the Biden campaign, and they know this, that they need to show the energy of President Biden. And what helped him a great deal, it's interesting because he had a lot of interesting things to say in the State of the Union, but the thing that probably helped him most is that it was a very energetic, more than an hour speech during prime time in the United States. So that's important. They know that, and it's an intangible in some ways, so it's hard to overcome. But I also think the fact that Trump is sitting in a courtroom, he's his opponent, he's 3 years younger, means that that comparison is not exactly as challenging as if the opponent was Nikki Haley.
Thank you very much, Jen.
Thank you
Really
so much. It was
appreciate
great chatting with you.